All right, so welcome back. This is lecture number 3 for Introduction to Zoology. We're going to continue, obviously, with evolution, and we'll be doing so for most of the semester in some capacity. Though we'll start focusing more on cell biology and physiology and diversity of animals to kind of give you a breadth of what you would need to know as a biologist in regards to the field of zoology. And so Charles Darwin is perhaps one of the most famous names in science. I speculate that most everyone that's in this class has probably at least heard the name once in regards to evolution. Outside of like Einstein or something like that, most people, this is probably one of the most memorable, well-known names as a scientist. And so Charles Darwin, we'll get more into him soon. His claim to fame is obviously in regards to evolution through natural selection. However, Charles Darwin was a very productive naturalist. That was what type of scientist we would have called him. Though he was a biologist, he was really that more well-rounded, interested in nature in general, and generally speaking, not formally paid to be a biologist. So again, we use the word naturalist. He would be definitely a type of life scientist, but he got into quite a few different things. And he would have been very famous, particularly for his time. He would have still been an important scientist because he did a lot of work outside of evolution as well that was important, particularly in his time. Now, there's another person that actually should get a little bit more recognition in regards to evolution through natural selection that you may not have heard of, and his name is Alfred Russel Wallace. And he came up with the same conclusions in regards to how evolution would work in regards to natural selection. Again, when I say natural selection, we're talking about nature selecting individuals that may be more adaptive to a particular environment. So let's pretend we just have this hypothetical animal, and you have in the species some animals that are more hairy than other species in the same species, though. Again, this is hypothetical. Or we could even talk about elephants. What is a hairy elephant called? A mammoth. So if the environment became colder, like in an ice age, hairy elephants or hypothetical hairy animal would stay warmer and have a better chance of surviving, while those with less hair had a less of a chance of surviving. And if you have less of a chance of surviving, you have a lot less reproduction. And what do we know about reproduction? Individuals that reproduce have offspring that kind of look like them. So if you're a hairy elephant and you're surviving with other hairy elephants, you're more likely to have offspring that are hairy and may even become more hairy. So again, that's an example of one example of natural selection, hypothetically given, but most likely a good explanation for why at one time we had mammoths during the Ice Age, obviously. So Alfred Russel Wallace is also a scientist who helped come up with the idea of evolution through natural selection, and actually has an important role in probably pressuring Darwin to move along faster with his research. And we're going to get into a little bit more about Darwin's life. Darwin's famous for making this big world trip on the HMS Beagle that includes stops along the way where he would collect specimens and compare them on different islands. And going to the Galapagos is one of the most famous aspects of Darwin's trip that he's most well known for. And then looking at finches, which are these little birds, and noticing some had different sized beaks that improved their survival based on the type of food sources at those particular islands. And he noted, though, that the birds look kind of similar to what was found in the mainland, but different due to these different changes in the beaks. Alfred Russel Wallace did most of his work in what we would call Borneo today. And so Alfred Russel Wallace comes up and says to Darwin, who's pretty famous at that time, obviously, hey, I got this idea. What do you think about it? And when Darwin saw it, the idea is that Darwin was shocked that someone else could have a similar idea that could publish it and then ultimately scoop research. In the world of science, one of the ways that you become a famous scientist is to do research and publish that research before anyone else has. And so it becomes your discovery. And so it appeared to Darwin that he was about to be scooped for an idea that he had been working on for decades at this point, around 1859, if I remember right. Yeah. And so by the pressure that of the scooping, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace agree to publish together once they find out they're working on the same idea. And so they do a joint paper in the Linnaean Society. So they are both co-founders of evolution through natural selection. Darwin is more famous for it, and he arguably did or published substantially more. His book on the origin of species was a big hit in the world of science, and so that's where it really started to build up. But he wrote also quite a few other books in regards to evolution that had a profound effect. Remember that around 1859, we're starting to talk about, in U.S. history, we're dealing around the Civil War time. So it's interesting to kind of keep things in mind in regards to that. In fact, Charles Darwin and Abraham Lincoln, who's very famous in obviously U.S. history, actually shared the exact same birthday. So we'll get onto that in a little bit. We'll talk about Darwin's autobiography a little bit, or biography, I guess you'd say. So I want again to press on you that evolution is a tool. It's a way for us scientists, life scientists, biologists, to get at answering a lot of the questions by putting it into an evolutionary context. Things like bacterial resistance to antibiotics is put into an evolutionary context that helps us to figure out ways to prevent antibiotic resistance. And I think a lot of fields get touched by evolution at some level. Even social psychology fields would be touched by evolution. I mean, humans evolved in hunter-gatherer societies. That kind of small tribe living had a profound effect on our evolution. The shape of our head and skulls is referred to as neoteny, where we kind of keep this juvenile appearance. So there's a lot of things that evolution helps us to understand that I'm kind of digressing on. But I don't want to look at evolution as a debate of whether God exists or not. Remember, God is in the realm of the supernatural. A lot of it's based on a personal faith that isn't really readily tested by science. You can't develop a hypothesis that you can then go off and collect data easily or accurately to determine whether or not this supernatural being exists. And again, when you think about the diversity of religions, particularly if you add that diversity of religions in regards to human history, or some societies believed in multiple gods, some societies believed in one God, the whole spectrum, and then there's, of course, people that remove that one God and are atheists or agnostics. So I'm not, in regards to evolution, even going to touch, or scientists even going to touch on those topics, because it's beyond my realm to take a measuring stick or a ruler and measure the supernatural beings' existence or non-existence. That's just outside of science. I'm following a very strict rule. What is the physical evidence saying? And then I'm trying to piece it together. And so, like you said, going to a crime scene as a detective, All I can do is take the physical evidence that's at the crime scene and try to piece together some explanation to how that crime took place. I wasn't there. I'll never have absolute truth on that. But I will try to piece together something. And so that's what evolution is doing. And in regards to supernatural, for the most part, as far as I know, that can't really be measured. And so that's why it's outside the realm of science. Doesn't mean that your beliefs are correct or incorrect. It's just not something I'm testing. And so we use evolution in that way. Now, there are people that are scientists, and there are also biologists and evolutionists. And probably in their own personal faith, what they would say is God was the originator that put the rules into place that allowed evolution to take place, maybe some greater plan or whatnot. That would be how they would piece the scientific world with the religious world. Or they may not let the two intermingle and just realize religion has its importance, particularly in the human condition and societal conditions and so forth. And evolution is a tool for understanding. But realize that tool does change probably the way you see the world once you really begin to understand it and appreciate it. Now, the concept of, well, the ideas of evolution have existed for hundreds of years. The idea through natural selection, the theory that says, that the environment is shaping evolution, has survived for about 150 years. So it's a really strong theory that's been tested by thousands of scientists and still is supported. The legitimate scientific community has fully accepted evolution. There's obviously going to be scientists that are on the fringes that might be against it, or have slightly different ideas about it that are correct or not correct. That's always going to happen. But at this point, this is a very well received and accepted idea across the vast scientific community. Again, there are going to be exceptions, and they might be a little louder, and certain groups are going to probably promote them. But if you were to run across your typical science professor at a typical university, evolution is not any different than accepting that the world is, to me, it'd be like someone talking about whether or not the earth is round versus the earth being flat. To me, a creationist is almost thinking that the world is flat. That is how big of a deal that I've accepted the idea from what I've studied. It's just, to me, I think even when you look at the biology, you start to see those kind of things that I described in the last lecture. But that doesn't mean that we know exactly what's happening in evolution. Evolution can kind of be a fact and a theory and still have a lot of room for improvement in our understanding of how it works. What I mean by fact? Well, we know that dinosaur fossils are real. But you go up to the Chicago Museum, the Shed Museum in Chicago, and see dinosaur bones. Some of them, of course, might be replicates of a dinosaur that was found. And there's going to be a lot of fossils that are legitimately real there, but those are real ones of animals that no longer exist. In fact, most animals that ever existed are now extinct. So we were, I'm not sure what number of species of animals there are, but the vast majority are extinct through major extinction events, and this is what's left over. We don't have Tyrannosaurus rex and the dinosaur bloom that that was during the Cretaceous or the Jurassic period. Those animals don't exist anymore. That's what I mean by saying most species are now extinct. And sadly enough, there might be more extinctions going on, but this time it's more human directed, with changes in climate and the environment and so forth. Now, there are people that do go along with this idea called intelligent design. The idea is if, when they see the world being kind of complex, if you see a complex watch, you assume a watchmaker made it. And they might refer to themselves as creation scientists, but again, science has to follow the scientific method. You cannot use supernatural explanations that can't be tested as your conclusions if you're following the scientific method. It needs to be falsifiable. And again, that's why we have a criticism with intelligent design or creation scientists, is because ultimately their conclusions are a supernatural being made it happen. There's no explanation where the supernatural being and how they did it, or where they did it, or who made the supernatural being to do it. And we don't know if a supernatural, and as a scientist, I don't know if there's a supernatural being or not. If I'm following the scientific method, I just can't test that. And so that's kind of where we're left with. Is the other thing that's important about the scientific method is it needs to be reproducible as best as possible. Now, when we look at some of the fossil evidence, and we're talking human evolution, even though evolution is not about just humans, you might only have one fossil, one hominid, because it is hard to find fossils. Most animals that ever existed did not become a fossil. And so we're not going to always be able to reproduce it, but we try to be reproducible, and that's what makes something scientific. So if I'm measuring the DNA and trying to compare the similarities, I need to do more than one replicate to see. If I do an experiment to test a drug, I need to do more than one observation to make it truly scientific. Otherwise, it's more anecdotal. One observation is not usually considered good enough. I'm not saying it isn't good enough, because sometimes you don't have a choice, and you need to accept that there are limitations to your conclusions because of that. But you need observations, reproducibility, and be able to falsify it. And a lot of that is seen when you try to measure a supernatural being. Also, I think a lot of things get misconstrued in regards to evolution as well. And these include things like, so a lot of things get misconstrued in regards to evolution, and they kind of get wrapped together as a way of kind of attacking evolution from creation scientists, in quotes. And this includes things like the Big Bang Theory. And I'll see that kind of wrapped into this explanation of why evolution isn't real. The thing about the Big Bang Theory is that is not really evolution, so I'm not sure why it's been construed in it. Big Bang Theory is a physics idea that, again, I would accept that those scientists are probably have some idea what they're talking about, because the idea is that everything came together, and then we're seeing that galaxies and planets and things are moving apart, and these very smart scientists can measure with some pretty sophisticated tools. But that does not have anything to do directly with evolution. Evolution is dealing with origin of species. Where do new species come from? I'd even argue that abiogenesis, basically life from non-life, is not necessarily evolution either, even though there's, and again, this one's a little bit more murky what I'm saying. The principles of evolution through natural selection with species that we're dealing with now becoming speciating and becoming a different species is a little bit different than talking about the origin of life and how that happened. So obviously, origin of life has an evolutionary implications. There's probably chemical evolution going on, and obviously once we start having a cell, that's evolving. But again, it starts to, I think it's kind of muddling the waters a little bit to say, well, because we don't maybe, and again, I'm not an expert on this area, abigenesis, I mean. I have some ideas that there's a few different ideas of how life originated. But again, that's a little bit kind of a slightly different sphere of study than the origin of species when we have organisms that are being selected by the environment. So I'm just saying don't misconstrue those a little bit because, but again, there is a little bit more overlap in that regards. Another example of evolution is not, is when people like to ridicule evolution by saying, I didn't come from slime, I didn't come from monkeys. A scientist, biologist, zoologist, I would agree we didn't come from chimpanzees. Chimpanzees had their own evolutionary lineage. But I would argue that we shared a common ancestry. Now, it wasn't humans at that point, and it wasn't chimpanzees at that point, but there was an ape of some sort that went down a hominid path and one went down a different path that would become the chimpanzees and the gorillas and so forth. You got to remember, and I don't know what exact percentages, I hear different ones, anywhere from 93 to 98% of our genes are similar or shared with what is found with chimpanzees. And some people feel insulted by that, but have you ever, I mean, you go to a zoo or watch a nature movie in regards to gorillas or chimpanzees or orangutans, it's amazing first how incredibly intelligent they are. There's studies that have shown that even chimpanzees can use primitive tools like a stick to eat termites. They even use sharp sticks to poke and kill monkeys. Believe it or not, chimpanzees do eat meat. That might be something you might not have realized. Chimpanzees will eat meat when they can. They will chase, obviously they'll eat a lot of vegetative matter, and fruits and stuff like that. But they have been seen hunting monkeys, little monkeys, because chimpanzees are apes and they're hunting a little monkey as a little tribe, and they will bash it and eat it and share the meat. It's a big deal in that chimpanzee community. They've seen some chimpanzees use caves to live in. I'm not sure how sophisticated it is, but gorillas can do some sign language. So there's a lot of similarities intellectually, and they have a good intelligence. They have fingers and hands that look a lot like us. Now, they might be a lot stronger. They are a lot stronger. They have their own adaptations. You might say, well, wait a minute, I'm not that hairy, but our hairs we actually have similar amount of hair follicles, and it's just the length of the hair that is different. Some people can be very hairy. Again, lots of similarities. And the thing is there's all these hominids before that, from Homo erectus, to Homo sapiens, right? And Homo neanderthalis. So there was other species of humans or human-like beings. Neanderthals is a different species of what I'm broadly calling hominids or humans. Like, it's a different type of human. So could you imagine we're dealing with racism now, and here, if we had been around 10,000 years ago, we would have had a different species of human. In fact, there was interbreeding that occurred with Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthals that can be seen still in our DNA. We know that 2.7% of our DNA, well, depending on who, can have Neanderthal ancestry. So Europeans often have, and Asians often have quite a bit of, 1 to 2% Neanderthal ancestry. Neanderthals were seen in Europe, and so there was some interbreeding that occurred. I think when I looked at 23andMe, they approximately said I had 2.3% Neanderthal ancestry. So that's particularly pretty high, actually. So again, humans did not come from chimpanzees, and this is some kind of way of ridiculing evolution. Like, well, why didn't all the other chimpanzees become human too? Animals get selected for in their particular environment. There's no concrete direction evolution is traveling where it's constantly improving. Didn't have to be that way. So chimpanzees are amazing at being chimpanzees. Humans are good at being humans. You know, they adapted for the environment that they lived in. So again, evolution is not directional. It does not have to happen. Another term that's not particularly correct is this calling everything survival of the fittest. Oh, I know evolution, survival of the fittest. But it isn't exactly that either, right? It's not about who can run the fastest or strongest. It's fittest means having adaptations that are good for that particular environment, that increases maybe a small percentage of a chance of survival. So if you're a little bit hairier elephant during the Ice Age, a mammoth, mastodon, you have a little bit better chance of surviving, dramatically increasing your reproductive rate over thousands of years. You end up with a very hairy elephant. Now, I'm not sure what they know for what they speculate is the reason for the death or the extinction of mammoths, but the environment changed, the climate changed, that's for sure. The earth became warmer. The earth gets warmer and cooler, irrespective of what we've done in the past. The earth does have climate change. We are exasperating it most likely now, but climate change has always happened on this earth. I've already talked about this. Just realize, if you don't know this one, go back and look at lecture number 2. I talk about it quite a bit. But the point is that evolution isn't linear. You don't just go from like your great-grandfather to you, or from a fish to you. It just means that we share an ancestry. So like if we look, again, I won't go into much detail because I've already talked about this quite a bit in lecture 2, but you know, you and your siblings are much more similar to each other because of your parents. That's your common ancestry. Your cousins and you are much more similar because of your common ancestry with your grandparents. People in different regions are more similar because they share more ancestors in that region. Humans are more similar to each other, and in comparison to Homo sapiens are more similar to each other in comparison to Homo Neanderthals because we share a more common ancestor. Humans and Neanderthals, which no longer exist, except in small percentages, are more similar to each other than they are with other primates. And we just keep going on. Mammals are more similar to each other. Humans are more similar to rats than they are to salamanders because we share a more recent common ancestor. And that is determined at these different nodes depending on how you are putting together your evolutionary map. Now, some people also have a different way of thinking about evolution that isn't exactly correct too, called Lamarckian evolution. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck proposed that evolution occurred by inheritance of acquired characteristics. So what that approximates to, let me kind of explain that, is what he would think is that he would think of evolution as a more linear improvement. So the idea is if you're working out, getting stronger, that you would pass on that muscle strength to your future progeny. So that was the idea that Lamarck had for evolution, is that there was this acquired characteristic, acquired meaning you're doing this, or maybe I'm stretching my neck to get something to eat like a giraffe, that I would pass on those genes to my future offspring. But we know evolution for the most part doesn't work that way. It's through natural selection. So it wasn't, going back to my hairy elephant idea or explanation, it wasn't an elephant that said, oh, it's getting cold, let me grow some extra hair and become a mammoth. That's what Lamarck would think. Instead, Darwin would say, no, you had a family of elephants. Some were more hairy and some were not hairy. And the ones that were hairy survived in the Ice Age and reproduced at a greater rate. In warm environments, hairy elephants don't do as well. So you go to Africa and you see elephants with big ears, where it's particularly hot, to help dissipate that heat. So they have the reverse problem. So that's quite a bit different viewpoint than Lamarck had, which we consider generally incorrect in comparison to Darwin, who we mostly accept. Now, Darwin's idea of natural selection is not the only way evolution works. Evolution works through other mechanisms as well that you'll see as we get later into class. So again, what would be Lamarck? I want you all to think about this. What would be Lamarck's explanation for evolution in regards to the giraffe? Well, Lamarck's idea of evolution for this giraffe would be the longer the neck, they would be stretching their neck, and eventually they would get long necks that they would pass on to their offspring so that this giraffe can eat the tallest leaves on this tree. Darwin would say no. You had a variety of giraffe-like animals. Some had longer necks than others. The ones with longer necks got to eat more often, and by getting to eat more often, they were able to pass on their genes more readily because they survived better because they had more food. That's just one explanation. Imagine if these tall trees didn't exist. Giraffes with long necks would probably, in that population, would probably begin to get smaller because it would become a handicap to have that long neck if you don't have trees to eat out of. So the population may shift based on the environment. So again, evolution works like we see on the right side. You have a variety of different giraffes, some with longer necks and some with shorter necks. The ones with longer necks survived at a higher rate, reproduced at a higher rate because they survived. If you don't survive, you don't reproduce. And what happens? Well, tall giraffes with long necks tend to pass on those genes, and their offspring tend to look more like them with those genes that make them have long necks. While Lamarckian on the left, he thought that they stretched their necks and then passed it on, but we know that evolution for the most part does not work that way. There are some exceptions that are kind of related to this, but for the most part, we're focused and should accept that the Darwinian viewpoint is the way evolution works. So I kind of gave you some ideas of what evolution is not. It's not a way to reject your religion. It's not a, in Lamarckian viewpoint, it's not teleological, meaning it just goes in a certain direction. So what is evolution then? Well, let's define evolution. Evolution is a change in gene frequency over time in a population. So what do I mean by gene frequency? Well, your body has, as you know, in its cell, in its nucleus of that cell, DNA. And on that DNA are segments that we call genes, and they represent the making of a protein. Genes are the blueprints for our bodies. Let's just keep it simple. And if you have genes that tell your cells to make long necks, and you have trees with food with long, the reach, what's the population going to look like over time? the frequency of long necks will increase. Frequency is the meaning how many times you see it. Let's go back to our hairy elephant explanation again. In a cold environment like the Ice Age, elephants with more hair, hypothetically, as we explained, will survive better, reproduce more. So the population will go from some hairy elephants, some not so hairy elephants, over time in the Ice Age to hairy elephants, predominantly, because that's how they survived the Ice Age. Now, I'm not sure exactly what may have caused the mastodons or the mammoths to go extinct, other than there were some major environmental climate changes that occurred. And so hairy elephants no longer was a benefit. I know there might be some other explanations of whether or not they were hunted to death and all sorts of things, but I'm not an expert on that. I have not really paid attention to it. But what I'm trying to get at is, in this case, hairy elephants is the gene trait, and it increased in the population over time. So evolution refers to how an entity changes through time. That's what the word evolution is. Darwin has a slightly different way of referring to evolution, and that is descent with modification. The idea of descent through modification means that you have a structure, and let's go with the idea of the bones that we showed from a previous lecture. I showed you bones, and some bones became hands, some bones became legs, like if you're a dog or a cat. Some bones become wings if you're a bat or a bird, or flippers if you're a seal. They all have what they call homology. They all share this homology of similar bones, similar traits, that then get modified through evolution and adapted for an aquatic environment, or adapted for running, or adapted for picking up stuff or climbing. So that's what we mean by descent with modification. We had this hairy elephant population, not too hairy, but the environment gets colder, and so that hair becomes longer and more bushy, and so that's the modification that took place. So again, that's descent through modification. And we see this time and time again. And there's all sorts of examples that we haven't touched on. So the concept of evolution helps explain the great paradox of biology. In life, there exists both unity, meaning that everything is related to everything. In a sense, all living things are very similar in regards to DNA. I could talk about how DNA works in my body, and you'd have a reasonable idea of how DNA works in most anything. It also helps to explain the diversity. Why is there hairy elephants and not hairy elephants? Why are there polar bears in the Arctic and black bears down here in the lower 48, where there's less snow? Or hibernation. I mean, there's all sorts of things like that going. So again, why do we have all sorts of different types of bird species? But yet we have a lot of, they're all waterfowl. They're all the ducks and the geese. And there are all sorts of different types of ducks and geese, right? They're similar, but they're different because of how natural selection altered each of those different populations. So again, evolution is a tool that helps explain the unity and diversity of species on Earth. Evolution is an explanation that essentially all life is related. And I don't know why that's a nasty comment, or not nasty, a nasty or difficult concept. Like, even if you're religious and you believed everything was created from a God, why does it bother someone to think that you're related to another species of life on Earth? Why would it be bothersome to someone to think that you're related to chimpanzees, or your dog, or the tree outside even? because that's the argument, is everything is related. When you ultimately go down to the cellular level, when life started off as bacteria and then become more complex cells, then to colonies of cells, then to organisms made up of multicellular organisms. Some get photosynthetic and become algae, then ultimately plants. Another group is what we call autotrophs, eating, and then it ends up becoming animals. And then all the complex differences in animals. Why is it not a nice thing to think that you're related to everything? To me, I think that's cool to think that I'm related to everything on Earth. I think there are some cultures that respect life and think of life in that sense, that all things are related. So again, evolution is an idea. It may provide some predictive measures. Like I know that if I was a medical doctor prescribing antibiotics, I would tell you to take all of them. Because if you don't, there is a probability that antibiotic resistance will occur in a population of bacteria. How would that happen? Let's put it in an evolutionary context. Just like the hairy mammoths we talked about earlier, now we have this population of bacteria. Some bacteria is very resistant to antibiotics, some aren't. Or maybe they weren't much different, but then a mutation comes along and changes the DNA, changes the genes, and then you start taking your antibiotics, you feel better, you stop, you've killed off the bacteria that could not, I say weak in quotes, the bacteria that wasn't resistant to the antibiotic is killed off, but there's a few that are still resistant. Well, who's reproducing? The resistant ones. And all of a sudden we have this big population that's resistant. And remember, when we say genes, that means now we have the resistance gene. The frequency of the resistance gene increased in that population. So remember, evolution occurs in a population, not in an individual. Evolution is also a tool for understanding ourselves. When you take into account that we are some type of primate living in a tribe, a lot different than what we're in. Okay, so as I was continuing with this discussion of what evolution is, I mentioned that it's also a way to understand ourselves. Again, it's, when I took the 23andMe test, if you remember, that's a way to look at your DNA ancestry. I had an idea of where some of my ancestors came from. Now, again, evolutionarily speaking, all humans have come from Africa and then immigrated out to other regions. And so more recently, I know, obviously, as you can imagine, I have quite a few ancestors from Europe. I might even have a little bit of Asian ancestry, and apparently I also have some Neanderthal ancestry. Again, humans and how they interact, and and we're not always the most peaceful species. We know that humans do all sorts of nasty things to each other. Maybe there's something, where we've evolved from these small tribes where warfare was not nearly what it is today, where it was okay to have some of those love and aggressive aspects to our nature when we weren't able to have a nuclear weapon, for instance. We just had a spear. And so what I'm trying to get at is some of our nature is not conducive to the technological world that we've created. We also know, and you have to accept the fact that there is biology in all aspects of our lives. You're driven when you're hungry, you might get more angry. We have this animal nature to us because we are animals. We're driven, we have drives, we have instincts. It's not just learning. And even the way we learn is instinctively driven. And again, evolution helps us to understand some of this stuff. There's a field called evolutionary psychology that helps to explain some of this. And we'll get into more of that kind of stuff as we continue in this class. So evolution is important because it is, most things in biology would not make sense except in the light of evolution. Again, I can study the DNA of us. We can study the muscles and genes of a fly and know how the muscles and genes work in our body because of our evolutionary relationship. If everything was individually created and never changed, then obviously things would just be more categorical and have less meaning. So again, all life science is integrated by and influenced, and most fields are influenced in some way by evolutionary thought or evolutionary history. So here's examples of how evolution may affect just everyday kind of stuff that you may be interested in. Why should we be concerned with the bird flu epidemic? How would evolution help us to understand our COVID pandemic? Will a vaccine work? Will the COVID-19 evolve into another more deadly version of the virus or less deadly? Can we have herd immunity? These are all example questions that are kind of have an evolutionary twist to it. Why are viruses and things like the HIV so difficult to treat? Well, because that virus evolves rapidly. New variants of the HIV evolve, and so it can no longer be treated well by a particular drug. So a drug works great, stops the virus, except there's a few individual viruses that might have traits or some new mutations come along that alter the virus, and then now we have a new batch of virus from the same person that now no longer can be stopped by this drug. So now we have to give it a new drug cocktail and a different one and so forth. And this again is all related to evolution. Why is it okay to do lab research and have some idea of whether or not this drug would be deadly to a human or helpful to a human? Is because rats are mammals. And so there is some evolutionary kinship to us enough that we can test a drug and see if it makes sense to maybe do additional studies on humans later. But you wouldn't take an insect or a snail and test an antibiotic on it, because that's not going to tell you a lot, because those animals are so evolutionarily different from us that it has little meaning in comparison to a rat. And even then, a rat is still different enough from a human that we may want to try in a species that's even closer before we try it on humans. What about things like pesticide resistance? We're concerned about insecticides and things being overused. If we didn't have pesticides, we probably wouldn't have a lot of food. And so we have pesticides, we spray plants, they're protected. And then the next year, we had to spray even more because insects develop resistance to the antibiotic. Now, it's not just the individual insect. Again, it's from a populational perspective. We had these caterpillars. Some showed a little bit more resistance to BT corn or spray. And then the next year, that population has more of those insects that were resistant to the pesticide. And we understand that because of evolution. And so we may be able to come up with strategies to reduce pesticide resistance or antibiotic resistance by changing our regimen and maybe not spraying as often or spraying certain batches so we keep a susceptible aspect of the population still alive on corn that we don't treat. So we have the cornfields, one part of the field we treat heavily with the insecticide, one part we don't treat at all. And the idea is that we'll keep a susceptible population of insects over here breeding with these resistant insects over here so that the next generation is not nearly as resistant. But if we sprayed everything, only the resistant survive, we have a worse problem. So these are ways where evolution might help us to appreciate and deal with certain real world problems. And again, I think evolution touches on every area at some level. Might not all be biological evolution, but let's be honest. There is an evolutionary aspect to our technology. The cars are totally different, for instance. The environment is being selected. What do consumers buy? There's some programs that are, I think, again, I don't know a lot about computer science, but my understanding is there's kind of self-correcting, self-learning programs even that can kind of write themselves a little bit that get selected. But I don't know, that might be pushing it. It might be getting into a little bit of sci-fi, but I understand there's something like that going on. Obviously, evolutionary psychology and so forth, but philosophy is obviously influenced as well by evolutionary thought. So I was going on about Darwin. He was born on February 12th, 1809, which is the exact same day as Abraham Lincoln. Again, I think that's important because these are all obviously, it's not necessarily important that they're born on the exact same day, but it puts you into context that they are living in the same period of time, obviously. Both very important in the world history, particularly our history anyway. Darwin published in 1859, at the age of 50, The Origin of Species, that gave him a claim, along with our, obviously, he published a paper along with Alfred Russel Wallace, as I mentioned at the beginning. So they had the short paper that they published with Alfred Russel Wallace, and then he publishes this bigger book called The Origin of Species that became a big hit, right before the Civil War times. Before this happened, though, like everybody, Darwin was a kid and then grows up to be a young adult and then an older adult. When he was a young kid, he was a teenager, he was real interested in nature. He was a naturalist. He ran around. He was already kind of an amateur naturalist at that time, where he'd be collecting beetles and excited about insects. And there's a lot of kids and yourself that went through a period where you were probably interested more in the natural world. He was into hunting and stuff that was available to him. He was, I guess you'd consider kind of a aristocrat of his time. Came from a prominent family. His dad was a doctor, surgeon type. Famous clergy, I think, was involved in his family. And the interesting thing, though, is he had an uncle named Erasmus Darwin, who actually had some ideas about evolution that probably influenced Charles Darwin a reasonable amount. So he had relatives that were already kind of talking about evolution. But again, the idea of natural selection didn't come about until Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace proposed it. Now, I don't know if you've seen the movie Master and Commander. It's an excellent movie about, it's exciting and fun, talking about what it's like to live on a warship during this period of time. And HMS is Her Majesty's ship. In this case, it's HMS Beagle. And Darwin was the naturalist, but if you watch Master and Commander, there was a naturalist along with the captain, and they go to the Galapagos and they collect insects and animals and stuff like that to study them. So Darwin is joining this ship because he's an aristocrat. Darwin was kind of a student that wasn't the greatest student when he was initially in school. from what I remember. He was far too into his hobbies. But back then, a kind of a country gentleman could go into the clergy, or they could go into surgery and medicine. But he had a real aversion to medicine. He didn't like medicine at that time. Back then, being a doctor was more like being a doctor of death. A lot of the surgeries and things resulted in hacking off limbs and bleeding and all sorts of things that usually resulted in maybe more damage to the patient than the actual illness. The cure was worse than the poison. So Darwin had an aversion to going into medicine. And so he had some interest in the clergy, but not a glowing interest. But the clergy allowed him to do some studying by studying with the clergy. But he got this opportunity to join the HMS Beagle when he was a young man. I think he had written to the captain and so forth. Now, he wasn't necessarily the official naturalist, but he was a naturalist on the ship. That was one of his jobs. But you got to keep in mind, back in this time frame, fraternization among lower and upper class was really frowned upon, particularly in the Navy of Britain, because he's from Great Britain. And so a captain of a warship or ship could not just visit with a sailor of some sort. They kept it very class controlled. In fact, if you crossed the captain, you might get lashed. It was not unusual. And so Darwin was actually brought onto this ship because he was of similar economic class. And so he could be someone that could dine with the captain and be part of the captain's inner circle. So he was there as much to entertain the captain and talk with the captain and do things like that were involved on the ship. This was a year-long or 3-year-long voyage that went around the world, by the way. Now, Fitzroy was quite a bit different. He was the captain of the ship. I don't know exactly how he would have been as captain, but later in life, he had mental health issues, sadly enough, and ultimately committed suicide. He was a creationist who later regretted having Darwin on his ship because he felt like it had influenced and affected this viewpoint of creationism. Interestingly enough, Fitzroy was also, sadly, and this is probably not unusual for people at that time, accepted the ideas of slavery. But this is where Darwin dramatically contrasted with the captain. Darwin was an abolitionist. He hated slavery. It just disgusted him. Slavery and the racism of that time disgusted Darwin. And so they started kind of coming at odds with one another. And my understanding is from what I casually understand, is Fitzroy was really bothered that Darwin kind of came up with the ideas of evolution from this ship voyage and blamed himself. But I think at least in part was discovered for some of his letters. And I don't know about the suicide. I know that might be a little dramatic, but it was something, at least at odds, that didn't work out well. So anyway, before that, they probably, had lots of interesting conversations. So again, The Origin of Species is a masterpiece of a book, and one of the most important books of time. And even though I haven't really sat and read all of it or anything of that nature, but its impact was huge on our understanding. So before that, remember, Darwin, why was he so slow to publish? Why did he wait till he was 50? Because remember, he's a young man, he gets the ideas of evolution, but he holds back. Because most people at that time were creationists. And he didn't want to be treated as a heretic. he was at odds internally by knowing what kind of impact his ideas would have on society. And so he withheld quite a bit until, of course, Erasmus Darwin helped to spur it along. He had other friends that helped him, also encouraged him to publish, like Thomas Huxley, and that was Darwin's bulldog. So I've already kind of mentioned these kind of things. Darwin didn't want to become a medical doctor, didn't want to follow the path, hated the primitive medicine and the blood of his time. And I mentioned he was a naturalist on the, and I said 3-year trip, it's actually a 5-year world voyage. So this was a huge thing. And then he brought back all these specimens that he would study the rest of his life. So there's different things that kind of influenced Darwin. One of them was the Principles of Geology written from Lyell. So other fields of study was beginning to influence the idea of evolution. One of these being Lyell's Principles of Geology that argue that the Earth was far older than 6,000 years, like a typical creationist kind of idea. You follow the Bible or whatever. This is where they got the idea that the Earth was 6,000 years old. But when Lyell was studying geology and looking at how old the rocks are and how it takes, like if you have the Grand Canyon, think about all the time it takes for the sedimentation to form, and then you have erosion taking place where water's carving out these canyons. It takes millions of years to do something like that. And so that got Darwin thinking, because of works like Lyell's, that the Earth must be very old. They didn't know it was 4 billion years old. Again, that's our best understanding based on a lot of science. But so here's kind of the voyage that Darwin took. They left Britain from Europe, traveled down to South America and made their little forays into the forest, and then came around, hit the Galapagos on the other side of South America, traveled around, hit Australia, southern Africa, back over to South America, and then back up to Europe. And then along this entire journey, they're collecting samples and doing whatever else they need to. So this is in 1840, by the way. Now, I mentioned this, I'm just going to digress for a minute. What is other evidence that we have that the Earth is really old? Well, this map even might tell you some of that. The idea of plate tectonics, which wasn't necessarily thought about back then, became more well known. So if you look at these continents, here we got Africa and South America. So we have Africa and South America. Notice how well this part of South America would fit into Africa. Notice how this part of Spain could fit into the Gulf, and that these portions could come together, and these portions come together like puzzle pieces. And then this part of Australia can actually float up into somewhere around India on one side or the other. I need to look at the picture a little better. So the idea was the Earth had a Pangea where all the continents came together. And then over time, these continents separated, and that's why we have these puzzle pieces now, where Africa and South America one time were together, come apart. We know that these continents drift maybe about the length of a fingernail each year. So it's an incredibly slow, long process. Again, demonstrating that the Earth is really old. So that was a little bit of me digressing. Anyway, this was Darwin's trip that helped him to collect the specimens and really take him on the journey of figuring out how evolution works. So what he'd seen was that, for example, these different finches, all similarly closely related birds, feeding on these different islands. Some were cactus eaters, some were insect eaters, some were seed eaters. They all kind of had a common ancestor that came from the mainland And when they're blown off due to storms and flying and so forth, they landed on these islands with very narrow environmental ranges of food that was available. So those birds that had the traits that were needed survived a little bit better, reproduced, and then ultimately became specialists over enough time and diverged, became a unique species that would feed on big seeds or have a small beak that allowed them to eat insects, or a beak that allowed them to eat the cactus. So you can see the beaks on the seed eater is dramatically different. Look how big that beak is, crunching seeds. While the beak of this insect eater is much smaller. And then, of course, this cactus eater has a slightly different beak altogether, too. And so the idea is that all these birds came from a common ancestor and diverged when they were blown off onto these different islands. The population shifted because of the type of food sources that were available. Darwin also started coming across fossils of animals that no longer existed, like sloths that were as tall as a tree. So these are all things that really influenced Darwin's perception. Here are some of the things that helped to alter the way Darwin saw the world that took place before his lifetime and after his lifetime. Well, before his lifetime. And how the world was shifted in its viewpoint, and also gives you some idea or some framework into some Western conflicts that might jar some memory. So let's just look at our timeline here. Obviously around 1750, we're starting to colonize North America. I'm sure you all seen Hamilton, so you know around 1776 we have the American Revolution. And then we have a French Revolution, and then we go through a long span of time. 1809, we see Lincoln being born, and then we have the Civil War around 1860s. And then The Origin of Species was published in 1859, not too far before the Civil War started. So here are some of the major things that took place. We had Linnaeus, who came up with the classification system for animals and plants. Linnaeus, we haven't really got into it yet, but Linnaeus gave us the structure for the binomial nomenclature in biology. So being called Homo sapiens, Homo is our genus name, sapiens is our species name, Homo sapiens. Hutton provided a framework that geology is a gradual process. Canyons take time to form over millions of years. Lamarck had some ideas of evolution before Darwin, that species could change, and that it was acquired characteristics. So the giraffe stretched its neck. So again, I should point out that Lamarck and his ideas come before Darwin's ideas did. But generally speaking, we determined that through science that Lamarckian ideas were probably not the most correct. But that was how people viewed the world if they accepted evolution at all. Malthus is an economist, and he's coming, you can see where it starts. His argument is that influences Darwin is that there's a limitation on resources. And so as an economist, he made the argument, why are we feeding the poor? Because all we're going to end up doing is getting more poor people, and we're not going to be able to feed. Eventually, we're going to have a population that we can't feed. So this got Darwin thinking that there is competition among resources. Not all individuals that are born are going to be able to compete for those resources. And those that can't better compete leave more offspring. Those that can't either go extinct or leave fewer offspring. And over time, things change. Malthus is influencing Darwin because, again, the idea is that there's a limitation on resources. That influences Darwin's perspective. Darwin doesn't really know that until he reads it later, of course, because he's not even born when it first comes out. There's another guy, that scientist Cuvier, or whatever, however you pronounce it, who's starting to really get into the fossils. He's making the argument that there's a lot of animals that were alive that went extinct. That influences Darwin's thinking. Then Lyell kind of brings in the framework of modern geology, showing that the Earth must be much older than 6,000 years. Because ultimately, for evolution to occur, you need lots of time. Now, you can have some rapid evolution, but time is critical for big changes in evolution. And Lyell's demonstrating that the Earth is really old, and so it's possible for that to happen. And so again, Darwin's born in 1809, and Wallace is born a little later, and then around 1858, 1859, they publish together, and then go on to, and Darwin goes on to publish The Origin of Species. Below are the books that were utilized or made during these different periods of time, where you can see, I talk about above where Hutton was born and where he comes up with this stuff. And so you can see in 1795, Hutton proposes his theory of gradualism. 1798 is when Malthus published this paper where the idea that not all individuals can survive in a population, there's just not enough resources. 1809, Lamarck publishes his hypothesis of evolution. Lyell publishes the principles in 1830. 1831 to 1836 is actually when Darwin does the traveling. I mentioned 1840, but this is, Darwin obviously does the 5-year period between 1831 and 1836. Darwin's writing notes, doing lots of studies, and writes his first essay, on the descent and modification in 1844. Wallace tells Darwin, hey, I got the same idea in 1858, and then ultimately in 1859, we have The Origin of Species, and that's an important book that influences biology forever, even though biology per se probably wasn't even really coined as a term back then, or at least not widely known. Naturalists have been a normal way of looking at it. So again, before that, Aristotle would have said species were fixed. The Old Testament would have said species are perfectly designed and never change. Linnaeus thought that organisms could be adapted even though they were designed by a species. And he's the founder of taxonomy. And again, he's the one that came up with the nomenclature that we use today to name species, like in our case, Homo sapiens. So Linnaeus is a very important person scientifically. And so this kind of gets into some of the different things that we've already wrote. Darwin wrote his essays. This is all in the timeline that you can review. In June, Darwin received a manuscript from Alfred Russel Wallace. They decided to publish together a short piece. Darwin finishes his Origin of Species. You can see this from the previous slide and the previous timeline. Darwin actually never used the word evolution in the first edition of the Origin of Species, but referred to it as descent and modification. Natural selection is what the argument was and is the cause of adaptive evolution. There's other reasons for evolution, but that's where that kind of information, that is his claim to fame, was to be able to do that. But again, he did a lot of other science that was important too. And so the idea of evolution from a Darwinian perspective is things branch off. I've been kind of doing this throughout the talks, and you've seen that with the nodes, and that the nodes is a common ancestor, and then off evolution goes in different directions. And so that's what this is showing you here. We have our tree, and at each of the branches is the formation of new species, and at the node of the branch, where I'm pointing, there's a common ancestor. And so at the base of the branch is the origin of the species, wherever it be the single cell organisms or whatnot. And so this is an example of a taxonomic tree cladiogram that's trying to describe the relationship of extinct and extant elephant-like animals. Not all of them elephants, obviously. Elephants are the modern ones that we see at the bottom. So let's look at this here. We have, and I can maybe find a little short video on this. Here we have, where you see my cursor, this would be the common ancestor for all of these animals on the right. There may be a fossil that they find, or it may be something hypothetical that they later will find. And so you see the hyrax, which is intact. It's an animal that we can find in Africa, that we find from morphological evidence or genetic evidence that it's close, it has some relationship to elephants. Again, I'm not a comparative anatomist, but an anatomist would be able to study this, as well as people that look at the genes of these different animals. So that's how we can say an elephant is somehow, at least at some level, more closely related to a hyrax than to me, because I'm a primate. I'm totally on a different evolutionary branch. Even a manatee, you can see here, is more closely related to elephants than we are. And that's depicted from this map. I'd be on a totally different branch. We would be on a totally different branch. They do find some fossils of animals that no longer exist that they put on the same branches as these elephants, but are very distantly related, 34 million years ago. So a hyrax and a modern elephant, they shared a common ancestor some 40 million years ago, from looking at this graph as best I can estimate. And then we have all sorts of different things like mastodons and mammoths that no longer exist. But we know they exist because A, we found fossils. Sometimes they've even found nearly intact mammoths that have been buried and frozen. And so very smart scientists, they spend their whole life studying this, put this tree together for us. And then we have our extant, meaning living elephants. We have here our Asian elephant. And then there's 2 species of African elephants. And you can see there's some differences in these 2 species of African. You may have only came in this class and thought there was only 1 species, but there's actually 2 species of African elephants. And then a distantly related Asian elephant that can be found in India, for instance. Notice how much different the ears are between the African elephants and the Asian elephant. The Asian elephant has a much smaller ear. African elephants need bigger ears to help cool their bodies in the savannas of Africa. They're bigger animals as a whole. And so this Asian elephant is more distantly related, maybe 5 million years, or excuse me, about 4 million years if you look at this, because here's the timeline down here. This Asian elephant is 4 million years older than these African elephants, who might have diverged about 2 million years ago. How did they figure that out? Again, looking at the molecular data, trying to follow a timeline. They pieced this together as best as they can. And again, these are people that are, and you might say, well, how do they know that? Keep in mind, these are people that this is what they did for their livelihood. They studied this, focused on this, trying to figure out the evolutionary relationship. They might have spent most of their intellectual life studying this. And so we got to give them some credit that they figured out some things that we certainly can't just argue against it without spending our lives trying to study it as well. So don't just dismiss something if you don't quite get it. But I think this graph does give you some ideas of their evolutionary relationship. And there might be another person who's equally intelligent in this area, or multiple people, groups, that may come up with a slightly different family tree for how elephants evolved. This is just an example of elephants. There'll be people doing this for birds of some sort. or some insects or whatever. Now let's talk about artificial selection and natural selection. Artificial selection is human-derived evolution. We are the ones selecting for traits in species. Why is this helpful for understanding evolution? Because we are directing the evolution by selecting for traits that we care about. And what I mean by that? Well, let's start with dogs, for instance. Some people like really small dogs, some like really big dogs. We have lots of breeds of dogs. Those breeds are carefully controlled by breeders. And so they have this idea of what a German Shepherd should look like, or a Great Dane should look like. They have dog shows where they pick the best in breed and stuff like that. And if you don't have the traits that you think that breed of dog should have, that breed is usually neutered. They really control. Individuals that really care about these different dog breeds really control as a group what that dog's supposed to look like. And so we end up with huge varieties of differences in species. Here we have a Great Dane, and here we have, looks like a Chihuahua. To me, this looks like two different species of animal. If I was to come across the fossils of these, you would think they're two different species of animal. I understand that they are the same species, but can these two animals interbreed very easily? To me, the definition of species is if a population can't breed together, they're not a species. Now, obviously, you can get this little Chihuahua to be a bigger dog, breed with a bigger dog, and then eventually there's a rainbow where you can kind of get them to connect. So maybe if you had a Chihuahua and it bred with a small poodle or whatever, but I don't believe this Great Dane and this Chihuahua can breed without the different sizes of dogs. Or you take, or do some type of artificial breeding or something like that. My point is that we, by selecting for these different varieties, have practically made different species, even though they're different breeds. And so if we can do this by our selecting, we say, you get to breed, but you don't. Nature can do the same thing. If you're a Arctic fox and you got fur that helps you to be camouflaged so you can get a meal and survive, not being eaten by a polar bear or whatever, you'll get to breed more often. That's how the environment does it. That's how natural selection works. Artificial selection, again, it's humans picking the traits. And this doesn't just happen in dogs or cats or whatever thing that we domesticate. A big part of domestication versus just taming is that we have selected traits in the animals so that they are more docile. So dogs, for instance, came from wolves of some sort. There, wolves or some other type of canine that wasn't a dog that we would recognize today, following humans, eating the leftovers that were thrown out or whatever. So before maybe artificial selection occurred, dogs that were more, or the wolves that were more calm around humans, weren't threatening to humans, willing to eat leftovers from humans, hung around as a selective factor, because it's not just selection on what it looks like, selection on behavior. They got to become dogs eventually through evolution. And from there, humans selected traits that we wanted, whether we wanted a hunting breed or a working breed or a breed that we had in our pocketbooks, like this Chihuahua. Evolution didn't have Chihuahuas running across the plains of Africa taking down antelope. They survived because we were able to take care of them. Dogs are intimately, for the most part, dogs are intimately need humans to survive for the most part. Most of their aggressive traits have been bred out, unless you're specifically wanting a fighting or aggressive dog. That's why they have a more puppy look than a wolf does. If you've seen a wolf doesn't have floppy ears. So again, we had a big influence on this. Even the food that we eat that are plants are selected by humans. Big, juicy tomatoes, big stalks of corn that you eat are all things that we selected as humans to eat. We bred them together. So we had some corn stalks. This is kind of a little bit of grass that had some food on it that was edible, sort of. And then early human farmers bred them together, and then eventually it became a big deal. Now we have corn companies, seed companies that do the breeding and figure things out on a massive scale. But all these broccolis and cauliflowers are all related to each other. And then we selected for traits that ultimately made broccoli that you eat today and cauliflower. So again, how does that influence evolution? Well, it shows you that we can make traits in animals and plants that look different than what they originally look like. We can take something that was wolf-like and make it into all sorts of breeds of dogs by choosing and selecting who's breeding. And so if we can do it, nature can do it. What about, and this isn't just in wolves, there was even studies done with foxes where breeders, or there was a fox in Russia, this fox farm, and they were collecting foxes, and they got to choose who they wanted to breed. And eventually the foxes only lost their wild trait that became domesticated and started looking like puppies with different colorations. They were no longer, they were quite a bit different in color and temperament and behavior than their wild cousins, because of how the Russian scientists selected the breeder. They did this as an experiment. They had foxes and they just chose the most docile and the ones that they wanted, and ended up with a puppy-like fox. Dogs are essentially puppy-like compared to the wolf wild species. Now again, obviously, there are some big and aggressive dogs, but for the most part, they are more puppy-like with the ears flopping and gentler personalities and so forth. And different breeds are more aggressive than others, and we've selected for that. So humans have directed evolution, and it provides evidence for evolution. Now, natural selection is a little different. Again, it's the environment selecting. So here's an example of how natural selection works. Here we have a caterpillar species. They're all the same species, and they have different colors. And I've seen this with caterpillars. You can have the same species colors. Some are greener, some are bluer, some are yellower. But the leaves that they're eating on are a certain color, dark green. In this particular example, anyway, hypothetical. And so which caterpillar is more likely to be eaten in this scenario? Well, the caterpillars that are blue, even though they're the exact same species. Then these caterpillars will become moths, lay eggs, and then what's going to happen to the next year's population? It's going to be greener. And so this is the explanation for something like a stick insect. Have you ever seen a stick insect that looks like a stick and walks around? Well, it started off as an insect that maybe didn't look very stick-like. And then over time, the camouflage increased because the predators were eating those that were more obvious and leaving the less obvious ones alone. So that's an example of natural selection. Nature is doing the selection. So in artificial selection, the human would have been picking the traits they wanted for their dog. In this case, the bird is running around eating the ones that they see easier and then leaving the more green ones that will survive and reproduce at a higher rate. So that's the difference between natural selection and artificial selection. So I think that's probably a good place to leave off. We'll come back to this. Let me see if there's anything else I want to add to that before we finish up this lecture. Okay, so this is probably a good place to stop for lecture 3. I'll provide a couple easy to watch videos on artificial selection and natural selection, and maybe a few other things for a short homework assignment. So again, you need to write a summary of what you learned from my lecture. Obviously, the big points would be things like compare and contrast artificial selection, natural selection. You should be able to explain those two things. You can also, kind of talk a little bit about Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace and a little bit of what you learned from his travels. So again, this should be single space typing, uploaded onto Western Online to demonstrate that you watched the video, help you with your recall of the video, and give you attendance points that you would have had if you'd gone to class. So anyway, I look forward to seeing you in lecture 4, and try to keep up with the homework. Make sure you're going to labs. Make sure you're also doing the online labs, and take care.